Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Big Boys Table, episode 15. I'm Pronigo, and joining me as always is IskatuMesk.
Welcome to the wall of fan noise.
Yeah, it's very hot in Canada. It's very hot everywhere, actually. The entire planet is melting. And the other reason my head's on fire is because E3 passed recently, and it was basically about as bad as a family member passing, so I think it's appropriate to say passed. One of the things that was announced at E3 was a sequel to The Last of Us.
Oh no.
And that is why the title of this episode is The Game Comes First. Because The Last of Us, as Mesk very well knows, was not really a game. It was more of a movie. Sort of like Metal Gear Solid 4. And I think that we can both speak to, and we have spoken at length in the past, about why your gameplay is more important than, just telling a story or making a movie. I think there was a game recently by the same people that made Max Payne. Maybe I'm mislabeling them. But they made a TV show that would play in the middle of your game. Like, you'd finish a level in the game and then you'd watch an episode of the TV show. It was really bizarre stuff. But bottom line is,
Would
seems
you say
like
it was the Dark Souls of TV shows?
Well, I don't. I guess it was pretty difficult to stay alive.
The fact that that meme is even a thing, I think that kind of says everything about the state of the industry right now.
Dark Souls developer From Software also announced a new game. It's about Asia.
Yes, they're bringing Metal Wolf Chaos to the PC. That's probably about the only thing I'm really interested in seeing.
Is there a particular reason, or do you just want to gaze at the dumpster fire?
It has Americans in it. And the dubbing sounds absolutely hilarious. I actually know nothing about the game in itself. It's probably going to be terrible, but...
Well, as is standard fare from Software. That's another issue, is because I've been told that Dark Souls does video game storytelling quite well as a result of not focusing on narratives and having a lot of cutscenes and just telling the story through the gameplay. But what would you say to...
Who the fuck told you that?
Some people.
They were smoking something deep.
Yeah, I actually had to ask them to share. And when they wouldn't, I promptly banned them from my stream, because that's the kind of guy I am.
Wow, you're such a dick. Such a manipulative dick. You're even manipulating my speech to become more Canadian.
I'm just a poison to the community. Come on, man. So
destroying everyone's livelihood.
I'm too colonial, I think, is the problem. At the end of the day, it all comes down to being too colonial.
Too white.
Well, at least my bird's black. At the very end of the day, we have the issue of developers, at least as a recent design trend, really trying to focus on having a really cinematic experience. And we've all talked about cinematic experiences and how they're wonderful if they don't interrupt game flow and have a lot of problems where, you're not actually playing a game for a good portion of your time spent with the game. It's an interactive medium. And that's why we created a whole episode of this podcast a couple episodes ago talking about storytelling in an interactive medium and what the steps you need to take actually are. And how you can tell a story without having a bunch of dialogue, without having a bunch of focus on some sort of narrative. You really can tell the story with a little bit of dialogue and a whole lot of characterization based on visual and interactive elements, like how aggressive the enemies are, what strategies they employ, and just generally characterizing the area with your art style. But most companies don't seem to have an art style, at least not ones that have created the games that I've played recently.
They claim it's photorealistic by making everything glossy and shiny like straight out of Doom 3.
Doom 3 is the game. Wait,
Doom 3 was the game where muzzle flashes didn't produce light.
Oh. So they were just like flat planes.
That's what it was
or
most well known for, yeah.
Well, why did they try to give a Doom game a story anyways?
Because it was hip and trendy to have stories. Don't you know about them JRPGs and their deep stories?
Well, I guess that's just a continuation of the point I was just making, is that I guess this idea has been around for a long time. The games need to have stories. That's the only way that they can be taken seriously as a medium. It's telling a story in a game, making it art. But,
you gotta have lens flares for it to be artsy, though.
Well, in that case, Blizzard is covered.
And it's got to be really brave. You got to have like a fucking trans table baby fur lesbian protagonist. That really is like the selling thing of all these games is they're trying to make a social statement because that's the in thing. So the whole goal of that is all marketing, because then the vocal minority will be like, oh my god, this game is so progressive. It's so brave of these developers to make this game and this protagonist. Wow, look at this as a society moving forward. And then that gets your Twitter posts and your Tumblr posts and your scat porn and your vor porn. And that gets you advertisement revenue, and that gets you attention. And some people who are really not into all that, but kind of curious what all the fuss is about, they get roped into it. And you know what? Your business model was already successful before you even released the product.
A sale's a sale. The problem, I think, is that you will have situations like... I mean, there are some memes that come out of it that are pretty good. Have you heard of Dream Daddy?
I think that was on Steam, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, that's actually something I could mention since I brought up Steam. You remember that some like random SJW got mad about the H games that were going on Steam, and then some Valve employee acted out of place and started sending emails to the developers. And then this had already happened before, but I forget precisely what for Hatred. When Hatred was going to come out, it got pulled by another employee doing something like that. And Gabe Newell, I think maybe himself, would put it up or something like that. And then these people are like celebrating on Twitter. Wow, it's such a movement forward for progressiveness. And then like Valve actually realized that somebody inside the company was doing this, and they turned around and they were like, oh yeah, by the way, you can post anything on Steam unless it isn't, I think they said literally illegal or blatant trolling. And that probably made like 2 or 3 people upset.
Well, there's the idea amongst the very vocal minority of the progressives on these social media sites that if you even give a voice to people they don't agree with, then you're basically Hitler. So, there's only a small amount of exaggeration in that statement, at least as far as my experience has demonstrated.
Insanity. Well, but that's the thing, though. That's the thing. Those people are like a magnet for attention, either by people who hate them or by the very, very few sub-people who agree with them. And what ends up happening is, if you make something that tickles that fantasy, which is precisely what Last of Us 2 is, because it sure as fuck isn't a game, then you get
I'm pretty sure you play as the girl from the first game. There's a lot of games at E3 that announced with female leads, and it was pretty obvious to me that all of the games that I saw that featured them in their trailers, or really was just being used as a marketing tactic. It didn't seem like they were particularly well-established characters with deep backstories and histories and, just anything you would expect out of a character, especially if they're continuing on an existing IP, like Gears of War is now having a female lead in its next main installment. But there's seemingly no reason. Like, the characters around them seem to be doing more interesting stuff, but you can't focus on them because they're guys. And white.
Oh, I remember now. There is one thing related to E3 that I saw, and I think that was right when it first started. There is yet another Battlefield game being made. Yeah. Yes, this like Battlefield 69 or something now. They made so fucking many of these games, and they all have less features than the very first game. And the trailer for it was one of the most poorly choreographed trailers I had seen since Diablo 3. It was just like so stupid. Like, I guess Americans, in some vein, I don't know if that was the case for this, but they look to the ridiculousness of Japanese trends that are really high right now. A good example would be JoJo, and they try to copy this over-the-top ridiculousness, but they do it with their own style of choreography, which isn't a style; it's all academic, and it's just
it's not suited for that. Yeah,
every single time.
It's not suited for something that's over the top. You're looking at photorealism as like an advertisement for your marketing, but you also want a theme that's crazy. Like, it's not going to work very well.
Like, you can do photorealism. That's not really the problem. It's the way everything is timed and choreographed, and the dialogue and everything related is so textbook. It's sterile. It's like the perfect word, sterile. You know, when you walk into a hospital and you just smell that chemical cleaning, that is precisely what all of these games are like. Even the ones that, if you look at the trailers and you look at the proposed gameplay, because it's all been doctored, you don't see any like technical flaws with them. They're so unengaging and forgettable. I think the only thing that like, because I am in Discord and they have an E3 channel, and every now and then I skim it just because I've got like nothing to do at like 2 a.m. None of it sticks with me except for Metal Wolf Chaos, because it's something I already knew about. Everything else is completely forgettable. Like, oh, From Software is making some Neo game. There's actually Neo 2, which Neo is kind of like Dark Souls and DMC. And I haven't played it, but I've seen some of it, and it looks like the core gameplay could be good, and the rest of it's janky, but maybe Neo 2 would be good. But it's like, you always treat all this stuff with a bucket of salt because there's nothing about it that really catches you. And pretty much everything from the West that I had seen is just sterile. It's just, they all look the same. It's photorealism can be done, and that in itself isn't necessarily an issue, taking something over the top with that. Like, let's take, for example, Transformers, the new Transformers. I think that if you had someone who was not Michael Bay, not J.J. Abrams, not like one of these big names who've made a name for themselves solely off of post-processing and waggling their dicks around, but somebody who actually, like, has an interest in Transformers, and you kept the kind of style, you could have giant robots or anything like that. Like, a better example might be Pacific Rim. Pacific Rim is, you know, live-action photorealistic, and yet it's, you know, giant robots fighting.
Yeah, it's like a more mature
monsters.
take on Power Rangers.
Yeah, and that worked really well. I think that the choreography and stuff in that was quite well done, and the animation and everything like that. It was really, really solid and enjoyable to watch. There was nothing really wrong with that at all. And I think you can take that example with something like Battlefield and look at that and just be like, you know, this is how pacing can be done in this setting. But when you look at the Battlefield thing, not only does none of it look remotely realistic whatsoever, like there's no way any of this stuff would actually be happening, but the way in which, the timing of way in which things are done is it's always so convenient. It's always so expected. It's like the stingers and Blizzard's things. There's always going to be a stinger when this happens. There's always going to be a basey drone when that happens. And it's just, you come to expect it because it's so academic. It's so sterile. This is what they teach you in your first college game design course. You gotta have a stinger here because it makes it epic. So now you've just seen it everywhere and you just come to expect it. And then when you hear it, it just pulls you out of the entire thing and destroys it completely. And then, you know, who knows, maybe the game's really good, but your first impression is now as negative as it could possibly be because they literally didn't put any effort into their promotional material whatsoever.
Well, putting effort into your promotional material seems like it would be second nature for these people who really like marketing. But I don't know, man. A lot of applause at E3. A lot of pause at E3. A lot of furries.
Just actually hop into this channel right now and see if anything kind of leaps out at me. There's some gifs of people ripping their pants off.
That definitely leaps off the page.
That's definitely a lot more interesting than most of the other stuff in this channel.
Yeah, so Last of Us 2, Gears of War 5, there are a couple other ones that have female leads. There's some Doom game is being released for the VR or already was released. I don't know why people are...
VR.
Yeah, well, that's another
What a
issue,
joke.
I think, where you're trying to make a game. You're trying to make an interactive experience, and your advertising isn't great with these...
It's even
like...
more fundamental than that. It's not even just about... You don't even get to the game before VR falls on its face. Because, are you familiar with something called screen space?
Yeah, as in, like, a concept for design?
No, as in the actual technological application of screen space stuff.
Oh.
For example, temporal anti-aliasing.
Yeah, I know. Like the screen space reflections and stuff.
All right, so just for the sake of the audience, I'll give you a really quick breakdown. So, screen space is slow as fuck. If you've ever looked at a game, Final Fantasy 15 is a good example where the hair looks like it's ghosting all the time and shit's fucked. I have some great examples in educational videos. And you also see it with things like screen space reflections. Final Fantasy XIV, there's one of the story quests where a table's in front of the camera really up close, and you can see that the shadows are very slow. A lot of this stuff is screen space. So what screen space is it's a post-processing filter. This is why FXAA is complete trash, because it is actually literally just a blur filter. As opposed to like analyzing an image and looking for edges, it literally just applies a blur to the entire thing, which is precisely what temporal anti-aliasing does. Well, anytime you hear temporal, it is screen space. So screen space is slow. What temporal anti-aliasing actually does is it takes several instances of a frame and jitters them around by like half a pixel and then gives you the resulting frame. So everything looks really soft. People's response to this is to apply more post-processing sharpening filters. Kind of like how Skyrim and their HD textures are just upscaled with sharpening applied in Photoshop. Very, very, very similar. Now, VR. VR, in order to actually play VR, I think you need a minimum of like 90 FPS to not get nauseated. But screen space always ghosts and looks shit. It's always looked like shit. It's just VR really brings up to the forefront how shit it actually is, to the point that, well, it's actually going to make you incredibly sick. But you see, because developers are so lazy, they've abandoned a lot of the advantages that things like forward rendering gave them, including planar reflections. We're only really starting to see those start to crop up in technology again. Once people start to realize how bad, because screen space reflections are not real reflections, they're based on the screen. So you have something called captures, like sphere nodes, and I think maybe planes and squares and stuff like that. They try to capture images of the scene, like a general vicinity of the scene, and then that gets applied to it. On a really grungy texture, you can kind of get away with it. It's basically no better than a cube map. But anything like water or marble, you guys have seen the videos from World of Warcraft or played it or whatever, with you're in a flying mountain, you're above the river, and the whole fucking thing is messed up. Yeah, it's infinitely worse than VR. So you have a game industry that has basically built itself in like 15 years of trying to get out of doing stuff properly and building this giant Jenga stack of shit on screen space, which is just garbage no matter which platform you're on, but is doubly garbage in VR. You actually have to rethink how you do a whole ton of things before you even get to making the game for VR. That's why Unreal 4 started bringing back in forward rendering, although I think it still is lacking a lot of major features. I might actually have to go AFK. So feel free to continue with what you were talking about.
All right, sure. So basically what Misk is saying is that VR, in his eyes, is a giant gimmick. Now, I think there's some room for debate there, but the current technology and the way that the technology and resources are being utilized by most developers is not a good argument for VR and its use. Furthermore, I don't really see what it can do to somehow increase interactivity, because most of the examples of VR games that I've seen have not really been interactive. That some of them have been for educational purposes or practice for like physical athletes. A lot of them are some sort of like horror game that's trying to immerse you and make you, you know, look at it from a cinematic lens, which again just feeds back into the whole Last of Us issue, where you're designing something that's more so intended to be interpreted as a movie than a game. And The Last of Us is basically like a piñata in most of our conversations, much like Flame Knives was when we were discussing Brood War campaigns, but there's a reason for it. The actual gameplay that you experience in The Last of Us is either underdeveloped or just not seen as often as you would like. So basically you have too few examples of actual gameplay for any breadth of time, and they are very far in between, to the point where you mostly aren't really playing a game. Any sort of quick time events, any call and response nonsense, I mean, that's going to basically not classify your thing as a game at that point. It might as well just be a choose-your-own-adventure storybook that you flipped the page to another page that continues your arc of the story, as opposed to an actual interactive choice that you have to make with some element of pressure, either be it through time or if it's a turn-based thing, more so about the end result, similar to like a chess game basically, but done in a video game space. Now, I'm not personally a big fan of turn-based stuff, but they do have some element of interactivity in them in terms of the planning that you go into doing, although I do believe that they are a lot more connected, a lot more intrinsically connected with the concept of like a board game, that as opposed to a real-time game where you have to respond very similar to a situation in real life. You have to respond immediately or as soon as possible, otherwise you risk, some sort of repercussion. And making the sort of worst or less effective choice compared to the ones that you have holds more weight in some environment like that, because the people who are able to do it in such quick notice are going to be the people who rise to the top of a competitive genre, or who are just successful in a less competitive, more single-player oriented genre, or cooperative, or whatever the case may be. You don't really get any of that in The Last of Us. You just get some shit where you gotta shoot, and it's like a corridor shooter type environment. Some of the levels were a little bit more open than others, but at the end of the day, it was mostly just a cover shooter, and it was very much like removing player control and power. You never really felt empowered to do anything. And people could say that, well, not feeling empowered to do anything in the middle of what is essentially a zombie apocalypse, you probably wouldn't feel super empowered to do anything. But I think you have to understand that when you're taking power away from a player and not allowing them to express any of their skill or anything like that, you're essentially not cultivating an environment that is enjoyable to play as for a gamer, for people who want to play a game. Now, I don't really identify myself as too much of a gamer per se. I actually don't play as many games as I used to. But when I do play games, I expect to have some sort of experience where I'm going to try to set the difficulty to a pretty high level, and I expect to actually lose a lot in the early stages, and then eventually be able to scale up as I get better, and not usually lower the difficulty and just try to continue on. And at whatever difficulty I've selected. Now, most people probably won't do that. Most people would probably aim for a difficulty that feels comfortable for them. But either way, they're probably looking for some form of challenge. And even if they aren't looking for a sort of challenge from the perspective of playing the game, they are probably looking for some sort of experience that, has them making decisions, interacting with game objects, and essentially not watching a movie or doing some call and response nonsense where the choice is already mapped out and the incorrect options amount to pressing the wrong button on a QuickTime event or some sort of QTE. Not QTA, button mashing situation, which is basically just a QuickTime event for DDR people. So at the end of the day, you're in a situation where you want some element of control over your game, because it's an interactive experience. So you want control, you want some power. You're not going to get that from stuff like The Last of Us. You're not going to get that from most of the Battlefield games, actually. There will be brief periods where the gameplay is suddenly more interactive, like usually they have some sort of vehicle sequence that's very temporary and very cordoned into a situation where, you start out in a very limited pathway. Usually it's very linear in terms of the level design. And, linear level design is fine as long as there's enough, decisions to make along the way. And I sort of prefer the idea of something like Halo, where the vehicles are not just, only showing up, only appearing at a single level or something like that. So when you see something like, I guess Gears of War 1 is a good example of this as well, where there's a single mission where you control a vehicle and you drive it around. And, that's basically like a micro mission in an RTS campaign. It's completely a gimmick. There's nothing about that where I'm going to learn some skills in that sequence that are going to carry over into future missions, because I'm never going to use this thing again. Where it's not a complete fixture, a more permanent fixture in the gameplay and in the game flow. So you don't get any game flow out of things like The Last of Us, besides knowing that a cutscene's going to come on soon. And you don't really get any game flow in things like Metal Gear Solid 4. I've actually seen an apologist for Metal Gear Solid 4 say that the way to experience it is to only play for about 45 minutes to an hour and then put it down and come back a week later. Yes, he said the optimal way to experience the game was to play it for an hour and then come back after days to a week. That was the only way to experience Metal Gear Solid 4. Because that's the only way you can truly understand the brilliance of the storytelling. Otherwise, you'll just get bored at watching 30 minutes of an ending cutscene and then an opening cutscene for the next one, because they were about 15 minutes each time.
It's funny when I forgot what you were talking about initially, but I ran to the door. Someone just left a letter there. I don't know what it is, probably anthrax or something. But you were mentioning about how Okay, I don't know what you're mentioning, but no, it reminded me that on Steam, how many screenshots, I mean, they're doctored, but how many of them, like, don't show the basic user interface or whatever? How, like, presentation is, like, entirely misleading to what's there?
Yeah, well, they don't inform the player of the decisions that they're going to have to make when they actually are playing the game.
It's kind of silly in a way.
Well,
Because generally
when you're
speaking,
looking at like a movie trailer or a movie like promotional poster or something, do you want something that's completely unrelated and misleading, or do you want a shot of all the characters or some sort of like stills of a an action scene? I don't know what the fuck they do for
usually
movie
what you get
development,
is a bunch of action, and it's like the highest budget part of the movie, so the rest of it is like just non-existent.
yeah, so it's still a little misleading, but at least that stuff is in the movie. You can expect that stuff to come at some point.
Yep. Then in a game, there is usually an entire aspect to the game that you don't actually see just by looking at videos or screenshots because they're doctored. Like, I honestly, like, when you see like these teasers and reveals for these games and they only show like rendered footage or a CGI cinematic or whatever, they're so meaningless. Like, there was an Age of Wonders 2 game that was hinted at with a CGI trailer that showed basically nothing except a futuristic city. So all you learn from it is that it takes place in the future. You don't know any other, like, the 99 billion questions you need to know about such a game to be interested in it.
Was this at
Because
E3 or when was this?
Age of Wonders 2 Shadow
Oh, Age
Magic
of Wonders 2, yeah.
was a pretty decent game, but then they made Age of Wonders 3 and botched it in an utterly spectacular way. We were talking with the developers directly on the forum and said, no, you shouldn't do this. It's a bad idea. They did it anyway. The game bombed. So, now people who got burned by that are going to be hyper skeptical about this developer, and of course they choose to move forward with another teaser that shows nothing, much less something that should say, hey, we learned from our mistakes and decide to go back to our roots and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, I mean, you'd think the thing that would be most exciting to people who want to buy games would be showing off gameplay that you believe to be compelling. Like you don't attract these consumers with action shots of a cutscene that they're gonna show once and they're gonna look at once.
Like, they can tie it together for the setting, but generally a game should be advertising a game.
Yeah, well, that's the big problem I had with this Cyberpunk 2077 game, or whatever that... I don't know what the game is called, but it's from the same people who made The Witcher, so it's CD Projekt Red. And there is literally nothing, or at least at E3, there was nothing released about the game, nothing revealed about what the gameplay would be. And it's not like this is a continuation of a previous franchise, like when they announced Doom Eternal, the sequel to Doom, the Doom 2016 game that came out. When they announce that, you can expect, it's going to be something similar to the previous title, because they don't usually deviate too much from their formula once they've established it. But this is a brand new IP that has never been experienced. Nobody knew what to expect from it. Nobody knew it existed until E3. Wow, what do you know? You've shown us a full-blown cutscene that's like, wow, we have good graphic designers and animators and programmers and people who can plug buttons on computers, and that's how we made this. And then there's nothing. There's no substance to that. There's no expectations to have, have to live up to. It seems actually like almost like they're really trying to play it safe and not announce any features until the release of the game or something. It's really weird.
Yeah, I mean, that's the market that they're marketing towards as well. Obviously, none of these games are made for people who actually want quality games, but more or less people who just want some distraction at the absolute best. And what I was doing before we started recording is I'm actually writing out the script. Each of the sides of the WoW series is going to have a conclusionary video to it that kind of talks about some of the things that were shown in there. So side A is going to be a deconstruction of some Blizzard behind-the-scenes videos that were on their FTP. Side B is tackling the whole problem of random loot boxes and stuff like that, but that originated long before loot boxes. I'm thinking baseball cards and stuff like that. Like this absurdity of being goaded into paying for something for a product you're not even sure you're gonna get, but the fact it's been mathematically designed to be biased against you as much as possible.
Yeah, it's basically gambling.
And and of course that's being rightfully banned in certain first world countries in the EU now, and hopefully that will eventually pass into the States. And I really hope it puts companies like Blizzard out of business, although it most certainly won't, because they're just sitting on an ocean of money. Nothing will sink them now, but I mean, a man can dream. because the whole concept to me is absurd that this kind of legislation is even necessary, because we have to have some authority that normally should never have anything to do with games have to come in and say, no, this is unethical, because people are so fucking stupid that they'll literally just hand these people money just for being face-fed shit. And even when you don't even consider things that are like absurdly, insanely unethical, like loot boxes and RNG and all that other shit, you still have all this other garbage in lauded titles like time gating. Like the very concept of arbitrary time gating is just absolutely fundamentally absurd. The very concept of you can't play anymore. You know, no matter what you do, you can't proceed anymore until this amount of time has passed. This arbitrary wall of you have to wait to do anything. That is just like this bamboozling. It just makes no fucking sense as a player. So why, as a game developer developing a game, would that make sense? Well, obviously because it plays into marketing, plays into, you know, forcing out longer hours and subscription fees and all this other shit. It's all about gaming, you know, the patience of the audience to try to make as much money out of them while doing as little as possible. And, you know, past the moral issues of all that, I just found it absolutely absurd that a game developer would actually willfully choose that route to development. I mean, obviously it's a business and you do whatever makes the most money for the least amount of work, but somewhere there has to be developers that actually give a shit about making games. Like games, not this garbage getting recycled at E3 and all this other crap. And there was a statement here. Let me dig it up from let me go find it here. It'll be all the way up in this log. I don't remember his name. He's the CEO for Platinum Games, Hideki Kamiya. So he made the statement, and this is quote verbatim on Twitter. I'm just throwing some ideas out there, but I think it's about time DMC got a game designer revision. Looking at current global trends and the amazing graphics in recent Capcom games, the next DMC game could do with a full model change, like the new God of War. Instead of being an anime-style hack and slash, maybe Capcom will turn DMC 5 into a realistic, cinematic action game. Now, this guy is well known for being a troll, so it is very possible that these statements are literally like a bait, given that he has shat on God of War in the past. However, at the same time, there's both like actual genuine truth in his statement and the absolute hilarious irony that if he is trying to be a troll, this is the same guy who pushed out Bayonetta, a game filled with fucking QuickTime events, and Nier Automata, a carnival tragedy fetish game that is an absolute joke of an ARPG. So if he is trying to be snarky about God of War and DMC, he has already set the worst possible example for how to actually make games in the vein of DMC to begin with. Especially since God of War is a shitty carbon copy of DMC that's more like a cargo cult copy, given that they just took out all the actual gameplay and replaced it with QTEs, and that's precisely what Platinum Games has been doing with Metal Gear Rising at all. QTEs everywhere. Jesus Christ. So, but when you look at this, what he says is actually very truthful, even if it's a bait. He says these are the current trends, and the current trends is within this specific part of the market, within action RPGs, it doesn't pay to make a game. It pays to make a cinematic adventure. You've seen the new God of War, haven't you? Or at least to an extent.
Oh yeah, I watched all of Patrick's stream of it.
And you're familiar with the old titles, presumably.
Enough to know that it's a very big departure and that they basically made it into a movie.
It's not like the. This game is so like it's basically like it's like a slightly higher budget Viking Battle for Asgard with more QTEs. I watched a bit of a stream of a guy doing it, and it is the clunkiest shit. It's kind of like The Last of Us of God of War. It's like Billy regurgitated into his own gullet and this came out. But it's not just that they changed the gameplay and decided to be new and and creative and artsy with it. It's that they really just changed the whole identity of God of War for some reason. Now, God of War historically has been a very well-selling series. It was more popular than DMC, I think, for every installation versus every installation, actually. I think, actually, the most popular DMC installation was DMC4, which is widely regarded to be a failure of a game, given that it's only halfway finished, even though I felt it had the best controls out of them. But I have to go AFK in a second, but like, that evolution that this guy is talking about, I think Capcom, if they took his advice, like if they wanted to make a True to Blood DMC game, they would still be more successful if they just threw all that away and made something like the new God of War, because that is where the industry is at right now, and that is very much correct in that statement. And now I have to go AFK, so
Okay, bye.
it's annoying.
So, as Mesk leaves, essentially, my problem with the Devil May Cry series, and using that as a comparison, is that it hasn't been what this Hideki guy, I think that's his first name, had actually described it as. An anime-style hack and slash, or whatever he was talking about. The what was it? The DMC Devil May Cry? Why did they call it that? They basically called it itself twice. So I don't know about that one. That one didn't seem very much like the original idea of what the Devil May Cry franchise was. Now, admittedly, I didn't actually play it, so I'll hold my reservations entirely on his claims, but the idea that it needs to become less interactive and not more interactive in order to be successful just feeds right back into the idea that, regardless of whether or not he was sincere in his claims, a lot of people probably agreed with what he was really saying. You know, even if he was not sincere, a lot of people probably looked at it and said, yeah, that's actually a good idea. Let's agree with this guy. So, Mesk, are you familiar at all with DMC Devil May Cry?
Oh, God.
Because, am I correct in saying that DMC as a franchise has not actually been an anime-style hack and slash since that game came out and it sort of rebooted everything?
Why does Ninja Theory exist? Why does this company exist? And how the fuck did they get the rights to make DMC games? I don't know, but a Swedish man decided to take this. This is a guy who is basically like studied DMC3 and played a lot of it and gotten up to a pretty high skill level, and like at least like read up and studied on the communities for the people who play these games a lot to this day. Basically just people who just spam combos and try to get like absolute perfect combos, since the game has long lost any degree of challenge for them. And he took a plunge into the new DMC for
why is it called DMC?
Yeah, it's literally called DMC, and the new
Why?
one's basically DMC 2. Even though it's using the original story, it just has changed everything for some reason. And the DMC is basically like, have you seen my videos for Castlevania Rondo of Blood 79 and then Lords of Game Testing?
Yeah, I've seen quite the gap.
It's a departure like that. It's like that. It is actually that bad. It is that bad. The first boss you're fighting is this telegraphic clusterfuck, and it's got QTEs. And it's got angular cameras and stuff all over the place, like in Dante's Inferno. The enemies are just walls of health, and within like the first like 5 minutes of him entering the second area, there's a nice view of one of the skeletons, because it's always undead. It's always got to be generic undead with these American games. Is one of the skeletons just spinning in place violently. It's just... It's just mind-blowing. Like, I used some of that video footage in one of my educational videos, and just what I was watching was just ridiculous. And of course, you gotta have... they gotta make the styling system more edgy, so every time you get a rank up, you get some heavily processed mill voiceover, savage! And you gotta have like the blood effect on the screen. You gotta have that chromatic aberration and all the filters and crap like that. Yeah, the game was a fucking disaster. And I remember seeing a video of all the bosses and stuff in it. And I think some of the visual concepts were kind of interesting, but telegraphic bosses and stuff like that just don't belong in these kinds of games at all. They're much more fitting in something like a turn-based strategy than anything involving real time.
Yeah, well, I
Since they
mean,
pull away from real time altogether.
yeah, well, it's just call and response. You might as well just be playing a QTE or a button mash or
Yep.
something at that point. And I think that on the note of them having some element of creativity or just ingenuity with the monster design for the visual concepts. I mean, we've both echoed that idea from some of the Dark Souls bosses, like the Gaping Dragon was a one that I thought was a little interesting. Definitely didn't expect it. And then that King Seeker Frank guy, what the fuck was that? It wasn't even a boss. He was just a weirdo. I hit him in the head once, and then he just went back into the pit, and then I thought I broke the game, but apparently you could just fall down there and you're fine. So that was a learning experience. But at the end of the day, some of these games have decent ideas for single entities within their game. And sometimes there's like things like I think in Demon Souls, yeah, that was the game that had pretty decent voice acting. Like it seemed like I think you said there were radio actors that were doing most of the voices.
Yeah, that's what I've been told.
Yeah, so it seems like they had some degree of competence in certain departments, but it's never a fully fledged move, and very rarely does any of that competence feed into like the core gameplay and the core game flow of whatever your title actually is. So like what the player is doing for the multitude of game levels or phases or whatever, what the player is doing for the majority of the game. It never seems like they put a whole lot of effort into that. Halo is just corridor shooters. You got Gears of War, which is like cover. Last of Us was also pretty cover based, but mostly just didn't have very much gameplay. And then anytime you have like quick time events or call and response telegraph stuff, it feels like the developers. It's not even like they ran out of ideas, but that's almost them admitting they didn't even bother to start thinking of ideas in the first place.
Whenever you see QTE in a game, it's literally the developer like walking into your room and yanking the controller out of your hand and saying, "Hey, I don't know what to do here, so here's what Simon says instead."
Yeah, they literally. You might as well just not even play because there's no thought process. There's no hey,
it's like
like
you'd
skill
hit the
development.
pause button and you started like doing a crossword on the side or something like that for like a few seconds every time there's a button prompt on the screen.
I don't
That's
understand
effectively what
man.
it is, because you just are like ripped out of whatever it was you were doing.
Yeah, well, they also tried to do this in a way to make existing cinematics interactive. Is reasoning that I've seen espoused as like a supporting idea for this. But what I never understood about that is like you're supposed to be using cinematics as a way to like bridge gameplay or bookend levels or whatever the case you're doing. Hopefully you're not using them very much because obviously any second I'm spending watching the game instead of playing it is not really well spent. But at least if it's an established trope or it's something that you're already going with as part of your game, I won't be taken aback by it too much as time goes on. But if you are trying to make a cutscene interactive, then I'm not even going to be paying attention to the cutscene. I'm going to be too busy focused on what button I have to press next. So it defeats the purpose entirely of that sort of reasoning. And anybody who was using it for that or professing to use it for that was probably not too bright in the games department.
It's okay, you don't have to be bright to be successful. Metzen has proven that.
I can't believe he retired at 42 of all fucking numbers.
I just love that he says he's retired, but they obviously kicked him out. There's no way you just retired when literally you do nothing and just print money. You can never have too much money. But what's more likely the case is because you can't talk shit about these companies, they've got you under a contract, they've got you under,
oh yeah, no defamation
NDA and
clause.
stuff like that. Like you can't do anything like that. And I believe there's actually sabotage and some other. I can't remember what it's called, but I remember reading about some of their laws before if you leave a company or something like that. You can't like disclose company secrets or whatever. So
yeah, usually as part of an NDA, they have some element where it's like you can't. There's no defamation allowed in your like public discourse afterwards for a certain number of years before that expires, which is really fucked up. Like the fact that they still sort of own your speech to some degree.
It's insane.
After you've already left the company.
As an end user, you don't have to worry about libel or anything like that. But as a previous employee, I have to be really concerned about that. But what's more likely the case is because Metzen had been in the company forever, he obviously was very high on the payroll. I mean, the man just drank like crazy at work. So when Blizzard realizes that all he does is just have a dartboard with foul and void and chaos and dark and black
green
and,
and
purple
purple
on it, and just fling darts at it, they realize they can simulate Metzen with a JavaScript like a 3 or 4 line JavaScript.
Yeah, just have Officer
It will
Todd
save
play
them a tremendous amount of money. So the biggest part about business is cutting costs. So you just cut these huge dead hunks of flesh that have contributed nothing to your games that can't be done with like a 3 or 4 line JavaScript. And that's basically what Metzen is. It's just basically a walking soundboard of edgy, angsty words, just kind of cobbled together here and there, and that's it. And now Blizzard just replicates that using like a dank database intern from a bank, someone who really doesn't even have to be paid at all, or a JavaScript. And they just achieve exactly the same thing they had when they had Metzen, but they're not paying this drunkard, 5-6 digits a year to just consume air in the office space. So it is really all about cutting costs. And that happens to so many individuals who are in these companies. And of course, at the same time, when you let these guys go, you can't just say, "Oh, we fired this guy" or whatever like that. You want to make it appear as amicable as possible, because the very process of releasing these people from the company can be spun into a publicity statement, into marketing. Every single motion they make is marketing.
Oh yeah, it's a celebration of this person's contributions to this company.
It's like, oh, this guy did so much. Here's this great work, and it gets more people clicking those links, gets those almonds activating.
Activating almonds. Better watch out. There's other kinds of nuts in this pantry.
Hey man, some people are allergic to nuts.
Well, rest in peace. You know what I don't understand about the whole Metzen retiring thing, I guess this is like unfinished business with Blizzard, is we always refer to him, you, I think, coined the phrase, a singularity of incompetence was like the best way I've heard anybody describe Metzen. So do you think Blizzard will improve after
Jay Wilson will take over.
He'll double
Jay
Metzen's
Wilson will double it. He will double the singularity.
No.
And when all else fails, there's Brett Wood. He's also a Neanderthal. I have a Twitter post here. I would like to, since this is also something I'm quoting in this this script here, I'm gonna just put it in. I want you to read this rioter's post and see his position in the company.
Okay.
For the sake of the viewers, I shall quote it again. This is in regards to a crash that was happening in the game.
Yeah, for multiple champions.
The tweet reads, fun fact, we were actually looking into this issue for a couple weeks. Initially saw reports of it happening with Karthus. So they had reports of this severe bug. And it's showing up in LCS, which is a televised championship. Made it easier to track down. Turns out having all the logs and data from the game makes figuring out the problem easier.
So they don't have that in normal games? I don't understand.
The individual making this statement is founder and former lead of the playtests team at Riot Games. Currently doing other QA work on League. So he's basically like the grandfather of their QA system, according to that description. And he may as well be still like amidst the lead.
He's he's definitely still involved.
This is a super high profile guy making this statement where if you take it as he says it, he is saying they don't have the tools to do basic quality assurance and testing in anywhere besides LCS.
Yeah, they're highly televised, highly monetized.
He's literally like that. Like that's his pants on head retarded. The first response there is what everybody should be saying everywhere. From Harry M. What sort of response is that? Thank fuck you don't work for a bomb squad with that attitude. Well, the bomb went off. We knew it was here somewhere for the last 2 weeks. At least now we know it was planted in the basement.
Jesus Christ. You know, that reply is censored for me, so.
It has objectionable language. I'm sorry, if you are under the age of like 18, you have to consult your pastor before watching this podcast.
I like consult your pastor.
like this is the reason why I wanted to bring this up, because there's another statement that's absolutely insane, which is basically Square Enix says they can't have a housing item in Final Fantasy XIV, which is an MMO that has access to glamour which is changing the appearances of items, because it has, and I quote, something like a grandma dresser has a few hundred items associated with it. And they basically go on to say that moving around the item, the thing that references a menu that has access to things you already have access to anyways, is somehow insanely demanding on their servers. Like, they go through this long-winded reply basically laying out their incompetence for everyone to see. And it's far from the first time that they've done this. They constantly complain that this can't be done, that can't be done because it's too hard on the servers, when logically speaking, even for an amateur programmer, the server shouldn't be having any load from anything that's going on at all. Someone mentioned something about having they have something called an orchestrion, which allows you to play different music tracks from the game. And someone asked about having a portable version of that you could take with your character, like an item. And they said that would be too hard on the servers. Even though it's accessing music files that are on your hard drive. And like HKS explained the whole process to me before about the server architecture and the net code, where basically the client asks and the server says if you can do this or not, and that's basically it. So it's like, it's hard to imagine there really being a server load from something like that when you've already got music playing in zones anyways. Music is one of those things that's on your computer. It's basically a client-side thing. The actual process of playing the audio file and accessing the menu and stuff like that is almost always going to be handled by your system and not by the server. And yeah, like the server load is so small, but for some reason their system that they've repeatedly stated is so badly designed that they can't do super basic stuff like that without effectively bringing down the entire game. And there's just no real response to this. There should be just colossal public humiliation for these people that are just making these outrageous statements that if you take them as they're literally saying them, and you have no reason not to, they're basically saying they don't know how to do programming. They don't know how to design systems. And Riot, developers for the leading competitive multiplayer game in the entire industry, the entire world as far as I know, as far as video games are concerned, doesn't have a means to address logs and data from games outside of the LCS architecture. And that, whew, man, that's a doozy.
Yeah, that's one that's with programmers like these. How can anybody program an interactive experience anymore? Jesus Christ.
Like, you can't even make the argument that it's the programmers are bad, because with the budget these companies have, if you see that your programmers are not able to do their job, you just get new programmers. There's so many programmers out there. You have their pick of the litter. Who wouldn't want to work at a prestigious company like Blizzard or Riot? Because just having on your resume, even if you only work there for a short time, that you worked at Blizzard or Riot, it's practically a guaranteed job anywhere you want to go.
Well, for once, it seems like these companies are not thinking with their business sense.
Yeah, basically.
But it's really puzzling though. Like, why would they not try to fix these basic things? Presumably, the programmers are upset, or at the very least, like, inconvenienced at the fact that they don't have access to this basic shit. So why aren't they getting access? Why aren't they asking these? Why aren't they putting in requests for, like, hey, you want to, fix this problem so we can fix the other problems? Like, it's a pipelining issue. I would
like to reference. I don't know which specific interview it was, but I'm sure if anyone wants to hunt for it, they could eventually find it. It was an interview for, I believe, Michael Schaefer. I may be wrong, but I think it was for him. For, I believe, Diablo 2 Classic's release. And there was discussion about how they wasted a lot of time with really outdated in-house tools. Remember, Blizzard used a Mopac, I believe, all the way up until they switched to Cask. Mopac being from, like, Camelot Systems or whatever. They've used a user-end program for their own archive format since it was created and never had their own in-house tool whatsoever. And this guy was saying that the process for them to get their graphics into the game, they had no way to preview anything whatsoever. And he basically said, yeah, it wasted a ton of time in development. And they knew it was wasting tons of time. But rather than sit down and try to fix it, they thought, we could just live with it. And the net result is they wasted oceans and oceans and oceans of valuable development time, because companies like Blizzard are on a timetable. They say it's done when it's done, but that's PR. Again, they always have a schedule. They always have something they have to make in this amount of time. And the more time you spend putzing around with inefficient tools, buggy tools, or the lack of tools, that's budget and time that's could have been spent in game development now dealing with inefficient tools. That's why nobody ever used StarCraft 2's editor except for the terrain for anything in StarCraft 2 at all. Because the data editor was just blind compiled off a .NET library, and that was it. There's no way anyone ever used that to make an actual game. It was all strictly XML because they probably had some other proprietary tool for parsing that XML that could not release, a lot like how they used PSFX for animating the portraits. And of course, they can't release that either because that's middleware. So, but Blizzard acknowledged this in Diablo 2. They acknowledged that they had issues with this pipeline and the ineffective tools, but they enter the mindset where they think they're too good to step away and fix these problems and then continue forward with a less stressful, less wasteful pipeline. They think that they can just keep forcing themselves through this and just finish the project and not worry about it anymore. Well, then came along Lords of Destruction, which was a huge disaster for Diablo 2. It added so many bugs, and every single patch thereafter just fucked up the game more and more and more.
Fitting title.
The penultimate fuck when they added Peter to the game.
Who's Peter again?
Peter was the genius Blizzard employee who made a lot of very, very questionable under the hood changes in Diablo 2, adding an insane amount of bugs post Lord of Destruction.
Sounds like he needs a raise.
He is probably right side by side with Andy Bond right now, working on StarCraft 2's ingenious artificial intelligence.
You mean the one that builds roaches to counter void rays?
Yeah, they probably share a drink at the pub, being their cubicle every half an hour or so. Singing their golden thrones.
It's golden after so many showers.
Because a lot of these developers, they don't just sit in a window and look outside and there's people laughing at them. They literally surround themselves in an echo chamber and they believe they can't do any wrong. So this comes into actual development ethics as well, which means that if a tool is ineffective or they don't have access to things, they just think they're too good to really resolve that. And when you look at this statement from this Riot employee, it for one, the brazenness that he would actually willfully admit that they apparently don't have the means to even debug stuff outside of something like LCS, at least to the state that they could have addressed an issue that they had reports on. But the fact that they didn't unit test this shit to begin with, which you always should do in something like this, especially when the risk is impacting a televised match where real world money is involved, not just for the players, but for, marketing and revenue. Look at StarCraft 2 and the fact they couldn't even run televised matches over Battle.net because it was so bad. And the incessant connectivity issues and all the shit like that. How in almost every single freaking world championship for League, they have issues with the sound. They can never seem to get the sound right for the streams. There's major impacts for constant problems like this. But this game is not new. They're not going through growing pains. They're not just figuring out how to get the show on the road. They've been in the business for years and years and years and years, making millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars and handing out millions of dollars. There should be some degree of discretion, but he can just go out and say this because he knows there's no accountability whatsoever. Almost nobody is even going to bat an eye when somebody says, by the way, we don't actually really know how to test our game that well. I mean, that much is said when they publish all these patches to live with things like Pantheon's Ultimate spamming you with numbers because they left debug shit in for some reason.
How do you do that? What I want to know is, you've got this guy, and I wonder if this is actually just a misguided attempt at PR. They always say, they being the player base of League, that there's this running theory that, if anything bad happens on on the LCS stage, on the competitive stage where all eyeballs are watching, which is basically a giant marketing tool for their skins, and not actually really, they're not super interested in putting on a good show for the audience or having some competitive integrity. They're really mostly interested in trying to market the skins, and they encourage the LCS players to use skins as opposed to playing with defaults. And there were I don't think there was any disciplinary action when people didn't do this, but they certainly, didn't pull
Well, I
any
mean, that's also a
punches.
big reason why they make the team theme skins as well.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. So that the players of those teams who continue onward afterwards have a more incentive to basically market their skins for them. Market Riot skins for Riot without them having to really pay anything. I mean, they go through and put on this giant show, and it's basically just an advertisement for their game and their microtransactions. And that must be a successful premise since they've been doing it for several years now. But what really got me was like way back when in the day they actually announced that they were running at a loss for like the first 4 or 5 years of this operation. Now, that's probably not taking into account all of the money that they got from the advertisement, but at the same time, when stuff like that is announced publicly, usually as a response to criticism, as if that's going to like somehow alleviate or excuse your behavior, you're basically just putting on the clown hat at that point, like, oh, we don't have access to this information with normal games, but don't worry, now that it's happened on LCS in front of thousands of people watching live or otherwise, well, don't worry, we can fix it now. It's like, that's actually is just like putting a clown wig on. You're not really doing anything at that point. You're not bug testing your game to begin with. You're barely offering some sort of like promise for the future. You're just saying, hey, we can fix this bug now that it's happened on the biggest stage it could possibly happen in. Like, come the fuck on, man.
Like, I mean, there's definitely like some bugs and stuff that can crop up that a lot of like individualistic testing won't get, but there's a process called unit testing where if you actually perform it and properly, these bugs should never ever make it to a released project at all. There's like the most obscure of bugs you can really think of is like something that only happens very low level as a result of interactions with specific kinds of hardware, the kind of stuff that you may not be able to even have access to in your testing environment. But if things had been done properly from the ground up with unit testing, which people are usually too lazy to do, then you shouldn't really run into problems like this. Whereas Riot has, like a history of just connection issues and audio issues and stuff like that in their stages outside of the game as well. Like the easier the stuff is like you have people that have been practicing for years and years and years and years and years, and every now and then you're gonna have problems with hardware or whatever. But it's like really consistent that every single tournament has some hilarious issues happening with audio being stuck on one stream, the caster is being too quiet, the game being inaudible, there being no audio at all. Like, I watched not a lot of League, but enough to see that in almost every single time I watched it. And this is the thing too, the operating at a loss thing. Fake Go, the tablet game I was playing, I've heard, I don't have anything to back it up because I haven't actually looked into it, but allegedly the American side of it, because it's a Japanese game, is operating at a loss. And I don't really know how that's possible, given that they don't actually develop anything for the American side except for subtitles, which is most certainly not expensive whatsoever. But because there's no translation for the audio or anything like that. But the game is 2 years behind the Japanese version, and they're allegedly running the American side at a loss, even though I believe there's still some millions of players. And what that ultimately tells you is that out of the millions of players, there's not that many whales. So it's one of those things that's really for whale hunting. But also the fact it's 2 years out of date compared to the Japanese version, a lot of the incentives to whale for Americans probably not even in the game. A lot of the characters and stuff like that don't exist in the game and won't for a very long time. And then there's also the PlayStation 3, I believe, as well, was also selling at a loss. The individual consoles, because of the hardware they had and the Blu-ray drives and stuff at the time, they were actually selling at a loss. But what makes up for it is the licenses that they got from the developers who made games on the consoles. So inevitably you saw the PlayStation 4 and Sony continued to be super successful. You also have investors as well, which really muddy the image of budget quite a bit. Because most investors are not really that intelligent, and they can be goaded into investing into something if they think that product placement is going to give them a huge edge on it. And I don't really know about League, but it's definitely something you saw a lot with earlier StarCraft. You definitely saw a lot of these larger companies that otherwise had absolutely nothing to do with games at all, that would bankroll teams or tournaments within Korea, and they would get product placement and their banners and stuff within the televised shows. So when you start looking at the game development side, you have a really hard time really visualizing a lot of stuff unless you are like the CEO and directly dealing with these people. But a lot of it seems incredibly shady because, I mean, just take, for example, Kickstarter. There's a reason why it's called Scam Starter. Not just because of Scam Citizen, but because you have people like those guys who literally just spent all of their grant money on alcohol and hookers. I think they actually openly admitted to that. And there was no accountability or repercussions whatsoever. So, like that, it undoubtedly happens a lot with investment as well.
I mean, that just sounds like medicine.
Yeah, so it's investment and everything like that is just this really murky area I'm not really too well educated on, but every time I see involved with gaming, it always is for the worst.
Well, yeah, so the reason why I brought up the League example was just because it's another instance of unfathomable, like, realities being the case. Like, this was one of the most watched, like, broadcasts on all of these different streaming sites, and you're telling me that you're running it at a loss. I mean, it's not that much ahead of everybody else in terms of production value. When it started out, it was, but... Well, I'm, again, completely bereft of anything related to the game, microtransaction sales, anything like that. They're just talking about the LCS itself. The LCS itself is running at a loss in terms of it's not, generating enough revenue by itself to justify its own costs.
Well, look at Valve and Dota 2. Remember when they had that first tournament, they were advertising like $1 million prize pool or whatever, which I don't think League even had anywhere near at that point.
No, League's LCS winnings are 100K, and Worlds has historically been 1 million. I think they were able to get it up to 3 million with crowdfunding.
Worlds, like, this is when Dota 2 first came out.
Okay.
I think it was still in beta, wasn't it?
League?
Where they announced a huge prize.
Oh, yeah. Well, they had something, what do they call it? The, not the Invitational. I mean, the Invitational is usually where you see it most, but it's like the compendium or something where fans of the game can actually donate towards the winnings, and they usually are heavily monetized to the point where you see like $50 million or whatever of prize pools now, but before, I'm sure it was just it was quote unquote just $1 million prize pool, which was pretty high for the time of Dota 2's release.
Like that was the entire point, is that at the time it was super, super high. I'm pretty sure it was the highest that I'd ever heard of. And obviously that's going to come at a loss. Like, I don't think you're going to get that much advertisement revenue from one tournament to cover the expenses in terms of the prize pool, the bandwidth and resources to set it up and stream it, the technology and the staffing related. But the thing is, and this will definitely be the case with League and Riot as well, is it's a marketing platform. And marketing initially will be at a loss because you're making something that in itself is not really going to produce a lot of money. What Riot produces out of this is people who really get into the concept of being competitive. What Riot really wants is consistent whales. People who continue to play the game and continue to spend money on it. And that's especially, like you were saying, competitive players being encouraged to use skins and stuff. That's really one of the biggest hooks for it. Because if you play the same champion 300, 400 times, you're probably going to end up buying a skin for it. Now, to Riot's credit, as far as you can go with credit for this, at least you can still directly buy skins in that game, and it isn't all locked behind loot boxes. But don't be too surprised if that one day changes. Because the loot boxes are definitely a drive to hook into the whaling and gambling behavior of people. It was actually kind of bizarre. I'm sure we talked about this before, at least I mentioned it before, how Riot and Blizzard were just like ping-ponging off each other, copying off of each other for a long time when Heroes of the Storm came out. For their microtransaction platforms, how Riot just mysteriously came out with their loot boxes sometime after that. Or maybe it was Blizzard one of them was copying off of each other, and then Blizzard changed it, and then Riot changed it. I think Riot added their emoticons and stuff like that after Blizzard did, because they realized, wait a second, people can get too many skins playing this game for free. We've got to flood the loot pools with something that takes like no development time and is completely unrelated to skins whatsoever. Which is precisely what Blizzard did with Heroes 2.0, was to find a way to prevent people from buying skins directly. They also dramatically dropped the value of the currency. I know because I had like $40 worth of Blizzard bucks on that account, and they suddenly turned into like 1 unit worth of money. Like it was really weird. I don't know if it was really one for one. They just rose the price of everything or what, but it was really fucked up. And then people complained a lot, and the Blizzard was like, "Wait, we can make money off of this too. People want to be able to buy skins directly. So the skins that come out when a hero comes out can only be bought directly and can't come out of loot boxes at all, creating an even further divide in the acquisition of skins in that game." And
I wonder if they do that for Overwatch as well now.
I actually think Overwatch is more like League. I think that you can buy most of the skins with non-real life money, but in order to get a lot of that in-game currency, you have to get a fuck ton of duplicates. You have to get like thousands of loot boxes, because only duplicates give you a tiny pittance, and sometimes you get an object from them that gives you a little bit. It may have changed since I played it, which was quite some time ago, but
I think this all pales in comparison to the Valve Steam trading card game thing that they have going on. That's insane to me.
Valve has got it made. They've really taken advantage of that platform, and they've got it made. Blizzard wanted to do that. I guess they're doing it now with StarCraft 2. Now that they finally launched the marketplace, they're goading people's stupidity and making money off of it somehow. But Valve was definitely the American entrepreneur for that frontier in the West.
Well, the trading card game is so weird. Like there are this is like people clamoring riot to make more skins so that they can spend more money. Like that's about as insane. Except you're not even getting content when you're spending your money. In this case, like you're buying. There are people who buy games just so that they can idle in the main menus to get the trading cards.
Yes, I know people who idle in them to try to sell them. In fact,
yeah, that's why most of them do it.
A friend of someone that I talked to, she idled in a game called Primal Rage and sold some random skin that she got off of just idling in it for $70, and that's not even really that much in the grand scheme of things. But just think about it. You paid $70 for a retexture of a dinosaur in a game. $70. For $70, you could hire someone to reverse engineer the entire game and inject all of your own skins into it. Because I'm not even joking. It's people who you can buy their services to do stuff like that, and it's going to be cheaper than that, because a lot of the people do it just for the challenge of reversing people's compression and decryption and stuff like that. But it's insane. Like Valve stuff, I actually find it really depressing. There was someone who is, I think I mentioned a story that someone told me about someone they knew a while ago that was sold all their mother's the life insurance money or whatever when she died, and bought like $2,000 worth of Counter-Strike skins. And like the fact that there is enough skins, or that skins can be at such a value where you can spend $2,000, that alone to me is just unbelievable, especially being not really heavily involved, but at least like up to spec with the Counter-Strike customs community in 1.6 and Source, and playing a lot of bot games with those, and really getting into the custom assets people made for those games, and seeing what a joke Counter-Strike Go is compared to those, how awful everything in that game looks, because
most of those are user-made too.
Yeah, people made like fully animated, fully custom everything. People would go out into firing ranges and record and process their own sounds. Like a lot of stuff was really like super professionally done, and you'll never see that. I mean, I guess you can see that in Counter-Strike Go. There is or was a process to do it, but it was really convoluted, and they've probably patched it out by now. But
no, I think you still can. You just get like you can't play online. I think the server
consistency really flips out now.
Yeah, so if you try to do anything online, then I don't think you get banned or anything. I think it just doesn't work, or you have to,
It'll just prevent you from connecting. I think you'll get a server consistency. I think that's how it works anyways. Because basically, the server consistency, it existed in the other games as well. But basically, something can't exceed the bounds of this or that, otherwise you get a server consistency error. You can, as a server admin, just turn that off, or if you're just playing a bot game with friends or whatever, then that's not an issue. But otherwise, there is an SV consistency command that I'm not entirely sure how it works, but it means that you can't have like super big bounds for something, super big model for something, so you can't like have a supersized model for a player, so if they're camping behind a corner, basically, stuff like that.
Right.
So Go is probably very aggressive in that regards.
Well, I mean, all of this marketing and this microtransaction stuff, it all goes back to the idea that you should be having your game, putting that first. That's the title of the podcast. The idea that you're going to be focusing so heavily on trying to get a marketing team together and do all this other stuff, trying to have the microtransactions just right, or like Valve have this crazy system going on where they monetize some of the Dota 2 custom content as well. There was like they were before Blizzard.
There's
with,
a reason why
marketing
marketing is such a huge subject when it comes to education. It's a really deep psychological thing. Yep. Well, look at this. Isn't Valve dropping Windows XP support on Steam sometime soon?
Valve is, yes, that is the case for.
And there's lots of games on there that only work on Windows XP. Games that you may legally own that you're suddenly going to lose access to. Now, although this is probably not going to be evoked, if you look at the end user license agreement for a lot of games, I believe StarCraft 2 was the one I really started noticing this in. What the license agreement says is that what you have purchased from Blizzard is a license. You don't actually own anything about the game at all. Nothing. You are given a license to the game by Blizzard, who can revoke it at any point. And then you have all this stuff that's always online dependency. That is very much, and like you're saying, in which things are being treated as a service rather than as a product. And I think that mentality is super poisonous.
Yeah, well, just aren't there like there's so many laws in the EU, I thought, that were against that, because they're really heavily like focused on trying to be able to resell and like full ownership of whatever you have. So how does that work?
A lot of Americans that didn't want to abide to that privacy thing that went down, they just flat out block connections from the EU now.
So really?
Yeah, because viewing their sites would be illegal because they collect information on you and they don't want to tell you what they're doing. So they just block your connection entirely.
That is fucking insane. Tell you what's going on.
Yep. It's actually a pretty big thing. So it like the whole thing is just kind of nuts. Like, I try to wrap my head how to describe this stuff for this video I'm gonna be recording, because I sat down with my camera and my tablet and I was like, I'm gonna make a video. I'm gonna talk about phone games. I'm gonna talk about World of Warcraft. I'm gonna talk about baseball cards and all this other crap because they're all related, and the marketing thing. And I think, how do you actually, like, I know what I want to say, but it's really hard for me to actually put into words. But you see it all around you all the time. It's like air. You know it's there. You can taste it. You can breathe it. But it's really hard to like really get in your hands and really look at. And like, I think everybody knows precisely what I'm talking about when I talk about these things, but it's hard to really like get it down into a part we can really granulate it and analyze it piece by piece by piece, because that's how I prefer to do reviews. That's how I prefer to analyze things. I want to get past all the subjective things, like I don't like this, and get into the objective things. This does this and that, and really get into the nitty-gritty of it. But I think really, in order to really get in the nitty-gritty of it, you have to have studied psychology and marketing to a fair extent, because there's terminology for so many things that really trivialize the process of pointing out and identifying stuff. Like the trends thing, like to dial back to the earlier discussion from the individual, the CEO of Platinum Games, talking about trends and stuff like that. You know, it's always been really obvious that companies just copy paste off of each other because the other was successful. I mean, StarCraft and Warcraft and Warhammer and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all spawning their own kinds of things. Halo, all the shooters and stuff, Unreal, Quake. But now, like, it's more blatant today than ever. Shameless, even, with the Battle Royale shit that's going on, to the point of just absolute absurdity. The Dark Souls clones, all this other shit, just the people cloning, just the name the indie retro cutesy like 2-bit graphics made in fucking MS Paint that's become the popular norm because it takes no effort to make. And like it's at the point of just like it's gone past slapstick. It's gone past absurd. It's at the point where you start scratching and wondering, when is this going to actually end? And it won't. Because it's manipulation of the market. It's focused marketing and focused testing and targeting specific groups. It's rather like trying to manipulate those trends, trying to shape things towards that apologistic mindset in which this is what we want, rather than, you know, this is what we're asking for, if that really comes up. It's not like, I want a quality project. It's like, you told me what I want, so now this is what I want. Because that's the ultimate embodiment of the hipster, is to be told what they want. They need to be told what they like. And that's precisely where these companies want to be. And when I look at something like E3, just the skimming of it in these channels, I can see a lot of that. Where people will initially open up with something like, this looks really stupid. And then they try to make excuses for it afterwards. They try to acclimate with it, even though their first gut reflex is negativity. And I think that mindset is like, generally speaking, the gut reflex is the most honest thing you can have. You're going to have a gut reflex about, you know, a specific kind of voice, a specific kind of graphics, a specific interaction with a game. And that is the most, you know, honest expression you can get. And the moment you start trying to rationalize it, you start trying to cheat your way out of that honesty to make excuses. And when I see this shit in E3, my honest reflex, because I'm so desensitized, is not really just disappointment or disgust. It's like resignation that this industry just can't actually produce consistent quality software anymore. And that a lot of the developers and even the platforms that had hoped would be promising just seem completely lost in time. They're just completely caught in that moment, because it's not really about making games. It's not really about providing quality entertainment. It's about providing the most effective distraction. We go back to the observation, the sterility of everything that I see. Down to the voice processing, those Riot tournaments, the casters, their voices are so heavily compressed. It's just ridiculous. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. The sound quality for their casters is so bad. It has just gone through so many fucking compressors and equalizers to flatten out and boost out the volume as much as possible. I use a super heavy compressor to deal with the sibilance and stuff in this microphone and with my mixed audio stream. And the compressor they're using on a flat person's voice with no other audio stream in it whatsoever is still like 3 times as strong as mine. And you'll notice it in Blizzard's cinematics ever since like Mist of Pandaria. You'll notice it in the Heat of the Swarm trailer with Kerrigan's voice. That shrill, grainy, overly crunchy, kind of like they've removed the low end so they can boost up the mid-range. And it's like hard on the ears. It's just really, really unpleasant to listen to. But now that's in everything. That's in all the audio you listen to now. That's in music. People do that to instruments and shit now too. It's all part of the loudness war. Like that's, you apply what the loudness war, if you read up on it, if you understand it, that's being applied to everything. That's being applied to visuals with chromatic aberration and shit like that coming back. That's being applied to the gameplay with QuickTime events and distractions and carnival games and QTEs. It's all about grabbing the attention and distracting and pulling you around and getting you doing what the developer wants you to do rather than what you want to do. And really, especially isolating your thinking, isolating out the gut reflex and forcing you to dance on their tune.
Basically forcing the developer's vision of what should be seen or played in any capacity is like basically it's anathema to what you should expect from a good developer who's trying to, you know, put forward a quality product that actually is done when it's done and not some sort of Blizzard PR stuff. I think that's probably as good a point as any to end this one on, because it really is clear that based on the E3 demonstrations and based on the design trends that uh, whatever his name was, the Platinum CEO, had espoused in his potentially trolling tweet, based on all of that stuff, it's pretty clear that the industry at large doesn't actually care about the games they're making. More so, they care about making sales and other things that actually sort of benefit their bottom line, like having these buzzwords and these, marketing check boxes that they can check off. This little checklist that they have, where they have a female lead or diverse casting or whatever, and then they have the cinematic experience and whatever that is doesn't actually mean anything when it comes to the game and the gaming experience. Some cases it's the opposite of what you would want, and other cases it's completely irrelevant, like the diverse lead characters. Nobody cares about that. They really sort of care if the character is good, but mostly they care if the game is fun to play. So I guess for our closing thoughts, we can talk about what we should do as consumers in this sort of marketplace. What do you have any advice for people who are looking to actually purchase titles in the near or far future with this sort of environment?
So what I do, I take advantage of streams and YouTube videos. I usually look for something that is from a niche player, someone who has like 1,000 or less subs, preferably in the 2 digits, but has a high quality video stream, because that means it's probably just going to be a general gameplay video and not a lot of trash thrown on top of it. And then try to look past the fact it's another person playing and then judge it. That's probably the best way to judge things. I'm holding reservations about From Software's new titles. I think that Dark Souls 3 was a significant improvement over the other games, and I think that if they continue to learn from the example, they could actually potentially produce some halfway playable titles that are not riddled in bugs and shit. Maybe. I know it's really, really hopeful, but I will reserve that opinion for when I actually see what becomes of it and what becomes of Metal Wolf Chaos. And I can say I would have been interested in seeing Neo 2, although that may change after I play Neo 1, who knows. But the vast majority of it is just this ocean of drivel. And like, I don't even watch, like, there's a reason why I don't follow E3, because none of it's interesting. I don't like really following stuff that's in development anymore, because it's always so depressing, and because it's a very non-interactive process. It's like watching paint dry from across the street. You can't even get a taste for the paint. So to me, it's like, well, this stuff's coming out in some months, and then I'll have some gameplay videos from other people who have just gone ahead and bought it, that then I can kind of make a better judgment on, because promotional material doesn't give you a good idea of what something actually plays like. That honest feedback, watching somebody else actually play it in a non-doctored video, that's what's going to give you honest feedback, with or without a cast involved. So preferably for me, it's actually without a cast. But it's I'm gonna probably get suckered into playing that fucking new DMC game. So you'll at least get a mouthful of that when it comes out.
That'll just be depressing further.
It'll probably make me very angry. I have a feeling it's just going to be a DMC4 all over again. Not necessarily as bad as what Ninja Theory did, but still, it was Ninja Theory, wasn't it? I hope I'm not getting those names mixed up again. There was, Team Ninja's the one that I was thinking of that made Ninja Gaiden. They're different. Yeah, okay. But I don't think it's going to be as bad as that American version, but I think it's Capcom, and they've screwed up so many promising games like Dragon's Dogma, just shafting them over and over and over again. Capcom is like really, really determined to see how far they can go without going bankrupt in destroying games and potential, and just shitting all over their own team's work. So it's I'm not holding my breath, but guess we'll find out.
Yeah, Ninja Theory headed DMC. So
it's fun. They made Heavenly Sword, if I remember. I think that was actually their pilot title. And
you had to see where they went afterwards.
Yeah, it was really bizarre where they went afterwards. It's certainly not where I would have expected them to go. Heavenly Sword wasn't a particularly great game. It wasn't even a really good game. It had a lot of amazing bugs in it, but it played relatively smoothly, and the choreography wasn't too bad. But the gameplay direction and design and stuff like that was really terrible. So yeah, it's not too surprising that DMC's gameplay direction continued to go downhill from there. But the writing and direction, like everything like that, tanked immediately. Heavenly Swords are they're only a half decent title in that regard.
Well, whether or not
Weird.
the industry at large will tank even further remains to be seen, but it does not look good. The forecast does not say.
Oh, it's not going to tank. It's going to keep growing bigger.
Well, I meant in terms of quality, but yeah.
When Billy gets hungry, he eats. And when Billy eats, he gets hungry.
And then Jay Wilson doubles it.
Then he double eats. And then he gets doubled again. And again. And again.
And then we double wish Necron a happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Necron!